Hello and welcome to the Publisherspeak series for Peer Review Week 2022. We're delighted to speak to industry professionals from across the publishing lifecycle about peer review with a focus on this year's theme, research integrity, creating and supporting trust in research. We are very happy to welcome Tasha Mellins-Cohen, Project Director at Counter and founder at Mellins-Cohen Consulting. Tasha has over 20 years of experience in scholarly communication. She has a deep appreciation for the changing pressures on publishers, funders, researchers, and research institutions, and is very keen on finding ways to help all parties work together. Welcome, Tasha. Thank you for joining us today.
It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's get started with Project Counter. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and what are the motivations behind it?
Sure. So Counter came about nearly 20 years ago now, when a group of publishers and librarians came together to develop a consistent standard for reporting on usage statistics. So obviously this arose in a time where mostly we were talking about subscription content, and that would have been journals and books, databases, and so on. But the goal was very much to have a standard that could develop and evolve over time to meet the needs of the industry. Now we talk about being consistent and comparable across publishers and over time. But of course, we do need to evolve. So we're right in the middle at the moment of a consultation process for the next release of the Code of Practice, which is very heavily focused on open access.
So the Code of Practice, this is something I assume publishers will have to implement to basically comply with your standard. How difficult or easy is it?
It depends who you speak to. So I have to acknowledge that implementing the Counter Code of Practice, if you've never done it before, can be a little tricky. There are some things in there that people do find difficult to implement. A lot of the bigger publishers have implemented it by themselves, and that's brilliant. But there are some specialist services around who will help publishers by taking their raw page logs, for example, processing those through the Counter standard and delivering counter reports. So there are ways to make it easier, and I am, of course, always available to help anyone who's got questions as they're going through that process.
I assume a lot of that work could also be provided by the hosting service. So if it's Ingenta or Atapon or any of those will provide the facilitation for this?
Yes, absolutely. They're all compliant. All the major platforms are already Counter compliant. Earlier in 2022, we released something called the registry, which is a database of all of the compliant usage data hosts. So that would be groups like Silverchair, Atapon, Ingenta, but also all of the platforms that are audited as being Counter compliant. That's publicly available, and it's easy for everybody to find online at registry.projectcounter.org.
Outstanding. Something to go check out. I'm curious, I'm sure you've collected lots of data on Counter. What's the verdict on subscription journals versus open access journals? What's the usage rate like?
So this is actually something that I get asked quite frequently. And typically what you will see is that the investigations, so that's people making use of metadata, the stuff that's always in front of a paywall, that's your title, your abstract, your author list. Investigations at the global level tend to be fairly consistent across different journal types. But the requests, so that's people looking at or downloading the full text of an article, will differ. And the thing that's quite interesting is that for an open access journal, a pure open access journal, or even an open access article within a particular journal, you will often see higher global usage for an open access piece than you will for a subscription piece. However, having come from a subscription background, most Counter reports are delivered at the level of an institution. So for example, the University of Oxford will get Counter reports from all of their publishers specifically about usage by that university's researchers, students, staff, and so on. And normally what you will see in those institution level reports is that usage of controlled content, so subscription content, is higher than usage of open access content. And that's because people can get hold of the open access content when they're off campus and not logged in. So that's an interesting dichotomy, and it's something that we are encouraging people to think about with release 5.1. We're suggesting to publishers that they really should be delivering global reports to complement the institution level reports to highlight the value of that open access content.
Great. What has been the response from libraries to counter? I assume that they would now get data on some journals or some publications they didn't consider before. Has it helped to surface some publications up to them?
So I suspect it probably does. Obviously, we grew out of a need from libraries. So librarians and consortia are incredibly important in developing the counter standard still to this day. When you have a publisher that has a big portfolio of content and they can deliver usage information about materials that the library might not be subscribed to, that can be quite helpful in highlighting to a library where there's content that they may want to consider in future. There obviously are challenges there because libraries don't have unlimited budgets, so they do often have to be careful about how they balance those demands from researchers that are sort of surfacing through the counter reports. Yeah, you can only make a budget stretch so far. Yes,
budgets can be stretched so much, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, when libraries make decisions on publications, on buying different types of journals, what role do you think retracted articles play? Do they look at the number of retracted articles in a journal when they make a decision?
So that was a really interesting question. And I think it's something that I would love to dig into with some of my librarian volunteers and the members of Counter. I don't think they necessarily look at specific numbers of retracted articles, but where there are patterns of particularly high rates of retraction, I do think that's something that librarians are aware of and take into consideration. I don't know whether it's necessarily a feature of subscription and cancellation discussions, but the question of how retractions work within the concepts of research integrity are very much something that librarians are considering. So there is an argument to say higher rates of retractions might indicate that a journal is doing better due diligence post-publication. But then you've also got the argument for, should they have caught this during peer review? So you can argue it both ways.
Fair point. But I think having the data definitely helps, and you can make an informed decision based on that. Mm-hmm. Now, the publications are no longer just about research articles. Now you also have preprints, you have datasets. How does Counter deal with those types of outputs?
So, I'm a big fan of transparency and openness. So personally, I think preprints are a great thing. The materials that I have published, I've always put out a preprint first. I think it's important to show you're working, in the words of my old mathematics teacher. I suspect that we are going to see, particularly with the release of the OSTP memo last week, I think we will see an increasing drive towards open data. And that, when I say open data, I'm including open software, I'm including open lab notebooks, so on and so forth. There is work to be done, actually, to some extent by groups like Exterm and CreaDocs in enhancing the profile of research data within published articles. We're not at the moment necessarily as good as we should be at creating those links between the literature and the data. And that's something that actually I've been doing a bit of a project with STM to help develop guidance for publishers about how we can improve that linking, but also how we can make things like data availability statements richer and more useful than they are at the moment. So more and better is the short summary for that.
Brilliant. Now, this data discussion now takes me into a good segue into upholding trust in research. And what do you think the scholarly publishing ecosystem can do to make this better in bringing more trust in the process?
I'm going to say transparency and openness again. And that's not just about making the data available. I think we need to do a lot more with everything within the scholarly ecosystem. So open and transparent peer review, for example. And when I say open, I mean the reports, the reviewers' reports, and potentially also the author's responses to those being published as part of the article package. But for transparency, I mean potentially naming the peer reviewers. And that obviously would need to be an opt-in thing. And I know actually IOP have recently put out an article showing that they got better quality peer review with double blind or double anonymized review. I have concerns about double anonymized review because there is a lack of that transparency. But on the other hand, I can see that it's protective for reviewers who may not want to be named in case they fear backlash and so on. So there's that part of it. I also think when we think about retraction, so going back to that earlier question, when we have cause for concern, we are not very good at showing what it is that we are doing to address those concerns. Now, I'm not suggesting that we knee-jerk, as soon as anything is raised, instantly put up a flag on the paper that says there's a concern raised about this paper and here's all the details. But we could certainly be saying a concern has been raised about this paper, we are investigating, and we should be showing the results of those investigations, including, actually, there was nothing to see here, or there was something to see here, this is what we've done, this is the result for this paper. And Crossmark is a really useful tool that is already out there that we could use to introduce that transparency to the post-publication review process. I would love to see more comments on articles after publication, but 20 years of experiments in post-publication peer review suggests that that's not likely to start happening at the kind of degree that we would like to see to really show possibilities for trust in research.
Right. The question I have with transparency, is there a way to measure it? Is there a way to say quantitatively that, hey, this is the amount of transparency or openness there is in peer review? And what metrics and KPIs do you think we should start to utilize to evaluate this?
That sounds an awful lot like suggesting a journal transparency score. We've got enough problem with journal metrics at this point, I think. I suspect there's probably a way that we could put together a sort of almost a matrix of the levels of transparency and the different types of transparency and openness that different journals embrace. So if you think about, for example, the Sherpa Romeo database, it's very clear about what types of preprint policy or post-publication policy there are for each journal for depositing content. We could probably extend that to look at some kind of journal transparency matrix, but I'm always wary of introducing more KPIs and more metrics to an industry that is already practically floating on a sea of metrics, and we're not very good at using them safely and responsibly. So maybe we need to start with that before we get into introducing a new tranche.
I think fair enough. I think you can drown in data and not know what to do with it. So yeah, absolutely. Something to watch out for. So in terms of conducting sound research and research assessment, what reforms do you think are necessary in the peer review process? What should journals and publishers and societies consider?
So for a start, we need to be embracing publishing negative results or null results, because there is so much research waste with people replicating experiments and potentially spending extensive amounts of time replicating experiments that somebody else has done and found unhelpful. So we need to start making those available, whether that's as a preprint or in a journal format or within a database. I don't really care, but those negative results, null results, need to become part of the scholarly record so that we're reducing that time spent. I think we should be encouraging people to try to replicate research that does show interesting results. And that means that we need open methods, open data, so that it's much more straightforward to say, okay, I've done the exact same method. I have got different data. My analysis shows different things. And that kind of replication study we could facilitate. And we could facilitate just by providing open data and checking whether the analyses match up, but really encouraging that as a valuable part of science or scholarship more generally, would be really important. In terms of research assessment, I think we've got a little hung up on impact in the sense of citations or alt metrics, and we're not necessarily that good at thinking about impact more holistically, because impact, yes, can be academic, but it can also be societal. And some things, some papers or books that don't appear to have a very high citation rate can actually have made a big difference to specific sectors of society. And that's something we need to think about more broadly than we do at the moment. It's not always just numbers. And I'm saying that aware that I'm heading up Counter and we're all about the numbers.
Fair enough. I think your point about negative results and also this publishing data sets, that's a whole new world that I think we're getting into, where it's no longer about the research articles, about all these results that are now available, negative or positive, which can now be built upon by other researchers and taken forward. And I think that's where your point about measuring impact comes in, is I may not cite a data set that much, but the amount of value that's bringing to the table in terms of guiding research down the right path is invaluable. I think that sort of tracking, you see Counter now starting to get into those sorts of initiatives where it starts to track the smallest piece of information that may be coming out as part of research.
I would love to start seeing Counter reports coming out of repositories like bioRxiv or medRxiv. I would love to see that happening. We already have something called the Code of Practice for Research Data. It's not massively widespread, but it is in use. And actually within release 5.1, we've done a lot of work to extend the data types that we cover. So when we say a data type, we're talking about, that could be a book, but it could be a data set, it could be an interactive resource, whatever. So we are trying to make the existing code of practice more applicable to other research outputs. I'm hopeful, but I don't think it's necessarily a high priority for most repositories at this point.
Okay. Well, something to watch for the future. So let's see how that develops. Now, coming to my final question and more of a vision as to where you see things are headed. How do you see peer review evolving? You've been in this journals arena for quite a few years. You've seen a lot change. What do you see coming in the next 10 years? What are the developments you foresee?
Do you want to know what I think will happen or what I would like to have happen?
Well, why don't we start with what you would like, and then we'll end with what you think will happen.
Oh. I would like us to start rethinking peer review. We have created a situation where there is a huge burden on researchers conducting peer review. So every article gets seen by an editor, sometimes multiple editors, and also 2 or sometimes more reviewers. I have to question why we need 3 or more people to look at a single piece of research when we have clear evidence that this is not necessarily catching all of the research misconduct or dubious behavior before publication. So I would like for journals and publishers to start considering whether actually an editor plus 1 reviewer is sufficient with proper open reports and justification for asking for revisions and then accepting a paper. I think that would be a really valuable way to reduce some of the incredible burden on researchers around publication. And let's be realistic. Research is what they should be doing. Publication is not central to their day-to-day jobs. They have to publish. Whether they should have to publish or not is up for debate. The reality of the incentives is that they have to publish. Do we really have to make it so difficult for them to also do peer review? So that's one thing. The second thing, obviously, is that I would like to see more openness and transparency about that review process. And the third thing that I think we will start to see more of is alternatives to traditional journal publication. So you've got things like Faculty of 1000 or the Wellcome Open Research Platform, which the Microbiology Society, my old employer, has now launched a similar open research platform. Those, I think, have a lot of value in providing venues for different types of research output. So it goes back to the negative and null results that we were speaking about, but it also could provide a venue for publishing conference proceedings more seamlessly. It could provide options for really short reports that wouldn't be a full research paper. Could just be, all right, I've got a data set, I want to make it available, let's chuck it in here. So different types of research output becoming more acceptable, I hope will happen. My wish list, I'm struggling to see why we need so many journals. What is the real value of a journal brand? I can see value in a society brand because this is a collective of researchers who have come together with an identity to advance their particular discipline. And I can see value in them saying, we are going to badge things that we think of as important, as belonging to this society or endorsed by this society or whatever. I don't really think that we need to have, 30,000 different journal venues? I mean, how is this of value? To me, that just seems like a lot of unnecessary inflation of titles. I think we could consolidate back down to more society-centric or disciplinary materials rather than everything going into a separate journal, particularly because, let's face it, most people find what they need on the web and they don't care which journal it's published in, they care about the article itself. So that's my wish list. I don't think that necessarily will happen.
I mean, yeah, I completely understand your point of view. It's about keeping it simple for the researcher, make their lives easier, make them focus on research and give credit to anything that they do, not just the final big research article that comes out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would tend to agree, and I hope that publishers will take your advice and start to see how they can get past it. Yes, there will be challenges, and you have worked on the publishing side before, so I know you know what those challenges are. But it's a matter of, I think, us coming up with the solutions together. The more collaboration there is, the more discussion there is, the more standards there are, I think makes life a lot easier.
For sure. Standards and infrastructure. Shared infrastructure makes an enormous difference. And if we think about things like Crossref, like DataSite, like the Open Access Switchboard, that shared infrastructure means that we're not having to reinvent things when we want to launch something new. We have a platform on which to build. And that's really valuable and not something I think we necessarily place as much emphasis on as we could, supporting that infrastructure. That's important.
Brilliant. Tasha, on that note, I want to thank you for a wonderful interview, a lot of insights, a lot of great ideas. I'm hoping everybody who's listening takes note, gets in touch with you and makes your vision of the future happen.
I'm glad you found it interesting. I just want to say again, I'm not a peer review research integrity specialist. It's just an area of interest. So thank you for letting me expound on my interests.
Great. Fantastic, Tasha. Thank you so much.